Actually, it's a fall of ISIS, Battle of Mosul.
The Battle of Bakhmut in Ukraine has gained notoriety for being the bloodiest and most destructive urban battle since the Second World War. However, not too long before Bakhmut, there was another major urban battle with thousands of combatants, untold destruction, and many months of bitter fighting. I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian, and today we are going to take a closer look at the infamous Battle of Mosul. In 2014, Iraq found itself in a period of immense upheaval as it licked its wounds from the American-led war within its borders that had started a little over a decade prior. The Arab Spring of 2011 and the subsequent eruption of civil war in neighboring Syria had severely destabilized the region, and the two countries had become breeding grounds for radicalism. In 2014, the situation exploded when the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, a large, heavily armed group of radicals formerly aligned with al-Qaeda, seized the city of Mosul. Triumphant, its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, declared the beginning of a new caliphate. Within a matter of months, ISIS tentacles spread across large swaths of territory in both Iraq and Syria, leaving a trail of terror, destruction, and death in their wake. ISIS' abject barbarism and authoritarian rule decimated urban populations, killing many and causing countless more to flee. After only 2 years of subjugation, Mosul's population had dwindled from its original 2.5 to 1.5 million inhabitants.
1 million.
Before we continue, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Opera. The Caliphate's rise did not go unchallenged. The Iraqi government, together with allied militias, Kurdish troops, and international forces, launched a sustained military effort to reclaim its lost territory. By 2016, ISIS had been systematically pushed back and was now forced to make a final stand in the city where its reign of terror had begun. With over 100,000 Iraqi and Kurdish soldiers set to clash with around 10,000 of Baghdadi's men, the coming battle would be the final major showdown with the extremist organization and would mark the largest military operation since the US's 2003 invasion of Iraq. Anticipation rose in the weeks leading up to the offensive
behind
as the US-led coalition airstrikes paved the way for the upcoming ground assault. Leaflets were dropped on Mosul, encouraging young male residents to rise up against their oppressors when the battle began. In response, ISIS fortified the city and its surrounding villages by building an elaborate tunnel system and planting IEDs and landmines along the roads. As ISIS scrambled for what was to become its own Battle of Berlin, the coalition's ground forces initiated its attack on October 16th from 3 separate fronts. The initial push was a stunning success, with 20 villages claimed to have been liberated within the first 24 hours of fighting. To the east, Kurdish forces had advanced with ease, while Iraqi troops and militia coming up from the south faced somewhat tougher resistance. The rapid advance, however, was short-lived, and soon the coalition found itself slowed down by suicide bombers, IEDs, snipers, and oil fires, which hampered visibility. To make matters worse, to the northeast, efforts to retake the town of Basheka had to be delayed due to a lack of logistical support. In the south, however, the Iraqi army resumed its advance on October 19th, surrounding the town of Karakash and reportedly advancing to within 6 kilometers of the city's outskirts. Signs of panic were observed in Mosul as many ISIS leaders were reported to be fleeing the city. Those that chose to stay behind were primarily expected to be foreign fighters and others with little left to lose. On October 20th, the arrival of a large convoy of Iraqi special forces known as the Golden Division marked an escalation in the fighting. Its expertly trained veteran troops reinforced the Kurds to the east and reportedly eliminated around 200 ISIS fighters in their subsequent capture of Bartella.
And they have upped the animation level. That's nice.
In retaliation, Baghdadi's furious men set the Al-Mishraq sulfur plant on fire, causing 2 deaths and nearly 1,000 hospitalizations due to fume inhalation. In another futile attempt to stem the coalition's advance, ISIS fighters launched a failed diversionary attack on Kirkuk, but its forces were repelled the next day. The coalition's advance remained relentless. By October 24th, 800 ISIS fighters had been reported killed, while 78 villages had been liberated. A day later, elements of the Golden Division advanced within 2 kilometers of the city, where they paused to wait for reinforcements. Knowing that the assault on the city proper was imminent, desperate ISIS fighters forced tens of thousands of civilians living in and around the city to serve as human shields, with reports that those who refused were executed. With Mosul's population being majority Sunni Muslims, the Shia-dominated Iraqi government feared that tensions between the two groups could explode. As such, it was decided that only the Iraqi army would operate in Mosul proper, while supporting militias would be ordered to remain within the city's outskirts. At dawn on November 1st, coalition forces commenced their assault on the eastern part of the city. Air, artillery, tank, and machine gun fire opened up on known ISIS positions in the Karama district as the extremists burned tires in hopes of reducing the enemy's
why the hand so big though? Again, like actually central toys.
visibility. Despite their best efforts, ISIS fighters could do little to stem the coalition's advance. By the next day, resistance in the eastern section of Gojali was reduced to a few pockets, while coalition troops managed to cut the supply lines from Mosul to Raqqa. Poor weather conditions, however, threw a wrench in the works and temporarily halted the assault. Moreover, continued heavy resistance forced the Iraqi army to temporarily withdraw from the Karam district a few days later.
Actually shaped by weather.
Still, the offensive was stated to be ahead of schedule, with the Iraqi Army's 9th Armored Division entering the neighborhood of Al-Entizar on the 3rd, and 6 more districts being liberated on the 4th. 2 days later, Iraqi forces in the southwestern front reported that they had recaptured Hammam al-Alil and were now just 4 kilometers from Mosul International Airport. Despite these successes, few in the upper echelons of the coalition's leadership believed that their forces would be able to keep up at this pace of advance. The protection of civilian life and infrastructure had been given top priority, which meant that their troops had to be extra careful as they moved deeper into the city. Regardless, coalition forces were determined to make their hated enemy pay for their misdeeds. And on November 7th, Kurdish forces, backed by coalition airstrikes, renewed their 3-pronged offensive to liberate the encircled town of Basheka. Most of the town was recaptured on the same day, though a small contingent of the remaining 100 to 200 ISIS fighters defending Basheka continued to resist until the end of the month. Similarly, the Golden Division and elements of the 9th Division began clearing the recently liberated neighborhoods and screening fleeing residents for any suspected ISIS members hiding among them. By the end of the month, it was assessed that coalition forces had secured 19 neighborhoods, or about 30% of eastern Mosul. In the meantime, the coalition's air force had initiated a concerted effort to destroy 4 out of the 5 bridges over the river Tigris in an effort to increasingly isolate remaining ISIS fighters in eastern Mosul from their compatriots on the other side of the river. On December 6th, coalition forces with heavy air support launched an assault on the final strategic Old Bridge, while ISIS troops counterattacked near Al-Salam. Though the counterstroke failed to halt the advance of Iraqi troops in the area, a bitter fight for the Al-Salam hospital ended in a coalition defeat, with 20 Iraqi vehicles destroyed or disabled. With about a quarter of the city now liberated, the coalition's assault was beginning to run out of steam. And on December 21st, Iraqi forces entered a planned operational refit to repair vehicles, resupply ammunition, and prepare for the next phase of the battle. On December 27th, coalition warplanes finally bombed the Old Bridge, effectively cutting off east from West Mosul. The second phase of the operation began 2 days later, and it aimed to seize the remaining ISIS-controlled districts in eastern Mosul. Heavy clashes erupted during the assaults at the southeastern and northern fronts, and the advance was slowed down further due to difficulties in distinguishing between civilians and enemy forces. As a consequence, civilian casualties began to rise as coalition forces cleared out the remaining districts.
But why though?
On January 6th, Iraqi troops entered Mosul from the north when they crossed the Al-Kawthar River and stormed the Al-Mutana district. 2 days later,
They cannot identify anymore between civilians and
ISIS fighters launched a counterattack against Iraqi forces advancing toward the Sukar and Beladiyat. But its forces were decimated in the face of heavy resistance and strong enemy air support. In the meantime, elements of the 9th Division and the Federal Police made a lunge for the Sumer and Domiz districts, and in doing so, were the first coalition troops to reach the eastern bank of the Tigris River. With ISIS defenses showing signs of collapse, the battle for eastern Mosul was now drawing to a close. Attention now shifted to the third and final objective of the offensive, the capture of western Mosul. Many, however, were well aware that this assault on the Caliphate's historical birthplace would be their toughest yet, and the coalition's men would have to be prepared to face everything ISIS could throw at them. With the collapse of the ISIS foothold on the eastern shore of the Tigris, swaths of surviving ISIS fighters made a desperate attempt to cross the river under heavy fire in a flotilla of some 90 boats and 3 barges. On February 19th, coalition forces were refitted and ready to embark on the final step of their offensive. With the help of air support as well as the on-ground advisors, the Iraqi and Kurdish forces advanced into western Mosul. The first major strategic point to fall was Mosul International Airport, which was seized by Iraqi forces on February 24th. Heavy fighting continued during the following week, including an ISIS chemical mortar attack in eastern Mosul, which injured 12 people. Bad weather also hampered the offensive, but by March 7th, the Rapid Response Division reported that it had captured the Nineveh Governorate complex, as well as the Mosul Museum, a central bank branch, and ISIS main judicial court. In the process, the following districts also had fallen under Iraqi control, together making up around 60% of western Mosul. The fate of the remaining ISIS militants in the city would be sealed on March 12th, when the U.S. envoy reported that Iraqi troops had cut all roads into western Mosul. With the city surrounded, and with more and more major landmarks falling into the coalition's hands, the fighting gradually moved into the ever tighter confines of the old city. Dozens of civilians were buried under rubble during the ensuing fighting, which rapidly transformed into a bitter block-by-block struggle. Bad weather grounding aircraft once again delayed the operation during the end of March, but even with air support, the going was tough. Deliverance for trapped civilians came on April 18th, in the form of a pontoon bridge over the Tigris. Close to 500,000 civilians would manage to escape the fighting during the next 2 weeks. ISIS fighters in the meantime continued to hold no such regard for humanitarian concerns as they fired a rocket containing a mustard agent at an Iraqi unit accompanied by American and Australian advisors, injuring 20 soldiers. By May 16th, coalition forces controlled close to 90% of western Mosul. However, the struggle to recapture the remainder of the city became tougher still, as it seemed that nearly every house and street concealed suicide bombers or booby traps of some kind. The remaining militants even began using women as suicide bombers, hiding among civilians trying to flee the city, leading to the deaths of dozens of non-combatants. Iraqi forces launched their final assault on the old city on June 18th, where it was reported that ISIS still held tens of thousands of civilians as human shields. 3 days later, a great explosion echoed through the city. The Great Mosque of Al-Nouri, the place where al-Baghdadi had declared the ISIS Caliphate in 2014, had been blown up. Although ISIS tried to claim that the mosque had been destroyed by a U.S. airstrike, the blast indicated that explosives had been deliberately planted within its walls. This final act of desperation marked the beginning of the end for the remaining fighters. Iraqi officials proclaimed victory on July 10th, but localized heavy fighting in the old city would not cease until the final pockets of isolated fighters were eliminated 2 weeks later. After the guns had fallen silent, the Battle of Mosul would enter the history books as the deadliest and the most destructive urban battle since the Second World War. After some 9 months of bitter fighting, around 6,000 Iraqi Kurdish soldiers had become
6K.
casualties on the coalition's side, while around 10,000 ISIS militants had perished in the fighting. Civilian casualties were worse still, with over 12,000 civilians caught in the crossfire. ISIS, however, had been dealt a fatal blow,
There's a lot of civilians is
from which it would not be able
dying
to
for no
recover.
reason.
The caliphate's influence in the region waned, and al-Baghdadi himself would die during a U.S. Special Forces raid 2 years later. Still, the trauma and destruction which ISIS had wrought left permanent scars on the region, with entire cities like Mosul left in ruins, and with thousands of families decimated and scattered. It will take many years for both Iraq and Syria to
Grant
recover
of
from this
the
catastrophe.
it should be a bit